Guys, John here, aka Tarkus from the Home Remote Google Group. I set up a little tutorial on triggers, their associated setters. We'll also get into element binding, which goes hand in hand with triggers. So let's take a look what I set up here. Basically, to start, I have 3 light switches. Each switch is attached to its own lighting device or its own binding. If I press the first switch here, it'll turn on the light, and you'll notice that this blue glow appears to indicate the light is on. This is handled by an image change. The second light turns on the light and changes the icon from white to yellow, and this is handled by color change. You'll also notice that this string of text popped up here. 2 lights are on. And this is handled by a multi-data trigger, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But basically what we're doing here is we're saying when both of these lights are on, then populate this string with the text 2 lights are on. You'll notice that that's the condition. Both lights need to be on. If I turn off one or the other of these lights, the label will disappear. The third light, when I press, turns the light on, and it turns this little icon from white to orange. The TV switch, when pressed, turns the TV on, and this digipad becomes visible, and the indicator turns blue. If I toggle it off, it reverts back. So let's take a look at these individual elements and see how I set them up to use triggers. First, I'll select my first image button. You'll notice I named it Light 1 or Light_1. It's important to name your project elements because, first of all, in your outline, it makes it easier to figure out what's what. If they didn't have that label on them, it would be hard to figure out what you're actually clicking on and what you're looking for. Also, try to use an underscore instead of a space, or I should say use an underscore instead of a space, because Home Remote doesn't like spaces. So let's take a look at the different types of triggers and what each of them do. To add a trigger, you hit this little plus symbol. You get this little pop-up with 4 different options. First, you have a data trigger. Data trigger basically is a trigger that's activated based on feedback from your devices. In this case, for our examples, we're using a light switch, which is basically has the status of on or off. So the data trigger is looking at that feedback, and it's basing what it does on that feedback. The event trigger is a trigger that is activated by a button press, a button click, button check. Multi-data trigger is a trigger that's activated when multiple conditions are true. You could have any number of conditions to evaluate, but for example, if you have 3 conditions, all 3 conditions need to be true. If one of the 3 conditions is not true, the multi-data trigger will not be activated. Property trigger allows you to set different properties for the element that you're working on. In this case, Light 1. Changing the background, changing the image, changing the foreground, changing a border size, changing a border color, etc., etc. So I added 2 event triggers, and this button is a toggle, and the 2 event triggers represent the toggle. You'll notice I have an event trigger of checked and an event trigger of unchecked, and to select the event, you just open this little pop-up menu and pick what you need. So let's go into the event trigger for the checked event. Okay, in this case, I added a data action, which is done by pressing this little plus sign and selecting data setter. And the binding for this is light1.switch. Now, this binding is selected from this list of switches that are attached to this Vera device that was added when I first set up Home Remote. Now, little tip, instead of going through that full list, if you want to type out part of the name, it will narrow down what you're looking for. You can see it kind of focused in on everything that starts with light 1. And I'll pick light1.switch. The operator for the checked condition is equal and the value is on. Okay, so the unchecked event trigger, we'll go into the collection editor for that, and it's basically set up exactly the same way, same binding. In this case, the value is off. Now we have a data trigger. As I mentioned, the data trigger takes feedback from your device, in this case a light switch, and we're dealing with an on-off status basically, and it will trigger based on the value that that device sends back to Home Remote. Okay, so in this case we set a value of on. So if Home Remote receives the value of on back through this data trigger, then it will fire the setter. And if we go into the collections editor, we can see what's in the setters. So in this case, this is where we're going to change the image, that image of the button with the blue surround, with the blue glow around it. I added a setter by hitting the plus sign here, and I set the property to image. Now the value that you put in is the name of the image that you want the image to change to. In this case, it's power_brushed_on.png. Now notice I put a second setter in here, and the property is inchecked and the value is true. Now this is check true setter is in here because if you turn on this light switch from a wall switch, you're not pressing the button in Home Remote. So what this setter does is it virtually presses that button for you. And why is that important? Because if you turn on the light from the light switch, and then you go back to Home Remote, and you want to turn off the light, that button in Home Remote is not checked because you didn't press the button in Home Remote. You turned it on from the wall. So what you would have to do is press the button to checked, then you would have to press it a second time to unchecked, which would turn off the light. So basically you would have to press the button twice to turn off the light. So what this setter does is it just checks it for you based on the feedback of on through the data trigger. Let's go to light 2. The name is light_2. Basically set up the same way. It's a toggle, event trigger for checked, event trigger for unchecked. The only difference being here is the device binding is now light 2 switch instead of light 1.switch. Data trigger in this example, the binding is again light 2.switch. The setters for this, in this case we're changing the color of this particular icon. Remember, it changed from a white to an orange color. So what I want to do is I want to add a setter and change the foreground to the value which is the color code of that color orange. The second setter is checked true for the same reasons we used for the first light. You want to virtually check that button when the light switch is turned on by a wall switch. And again, the value that these setters are triggered on is on, and that's set here. And this value can be changed to off if need be, but in this case we're using the on value to trigger this set of setters that are in the collections editor. This third button is basically handled the same way as the first two. You got a toggle with a checked and unchecked event trigger. Difference being this binding is light 3-dot switch. Data trigger in this case, the binding is light 3-dot switch. In setters, the only setter we're using here is in check true. That's because the only property we're changing on this particular button is in check true. Any of the visible characteristics, such as the color, the background color, the foreground color, etc., we're not changing. So this is the only setter that we're using here. The change is happening to this smaller icon, and on here I have a data trigger. It's bound to light 3-dot switch. The value is on because we want the feedback that comes through data trigger from that device. We want the feedback when it's on to fire the setter. And this setter is a color change on the foreground, and once again the color code here is that orange color. Let's move on to the TV switch. The TV switch has 2 event triggers, basically set up the same way as the light switches. You have a checked, unchecked. The binding in this case is power zone 2 TV dot switch. That's the case for both the checked and unchecked. Now we have 2 data triggers. First data trigger is on power zone 2 TV dot switch for the binding. The setter gets fired when the condition on is returned through the device, through the data trigger. The setter is set for is check true. Now, in this case, I have a second data trigger for the off value, which is checked false. I pulled this particular button out of my production project, and I needed that extra data setter or data trigger in there for the off value. This is a lot of experimentation, so basically, as in the example of the 3 light switches, I did not need that second data trigger for the off value. Let's take a look at this indicator light, this little blue light. It's a very small little image, and basically the image is either visible or not visible based on the status of this TV, whether it's on or off. So how we set that up is we have 2 data triggers in here. Okay, and also note that I named this particular indicator light, Zone 2 TV Glow. So the binding again is for the TV switch, power Zone 2 TV dot switch. The value for on that will fire the setter, the value on that will fire this, the value is on that will fire the setter, and in the setter I am using the property is visible and the value true. Now you'll notice that this little indicator light is visible is not checked, and that means the default value is false. So by using the value of on to trigger this setter to true, what you're doing is you're virtually turning this switch on, making that indicator visible. And basically you have a second data trigger that does the opposite. Is visible false when the value is off. Let's take a look at the digipad. This digipad is a canvas, and within the canvas are individual buttons that are the digit numbers. But we're going to apply our triggers to the canvas itself, because in turn what you're doing is you're going to apply whatever that data trigger handles to everything that's inside that canvas as well. So on here I have a data trigger, okay, and here's where I'm going to introduce element binding. If I go into element binding, you can see I checked this little radio button for element binding, and within the element binding I chose Zone 2 TV Glow, and I set it for is visible. Now remember, this little blue indicator light is the name I gave. The name I gave it is Zone 2 TV Glow. So what it's basically saying is whenever this blue indicator light is visible, so is this canvas. And that's because I have this value set to true. Because it is true that this light indicator is visible, then anything in this setter will be applied. And the setter I have in here is visible true, and this applies to the canvas overall. Let's go back to this label. This label utilizes multi-data triggers, and basically what's happening here is when both these light switches are on, this label is being populated with a string of text. Okay, so because both lights have to be on, we have two conditions. And because we have two conditions, we have to use a multi-data trigger. So we add a multi-data trigger, and let's see what's in here. I added two conditions. The first condition is the binding is light 1 dot switch. Now remember that this light is bound, this switch is bound to light 1 dot switch. So that means when this light switch is on, this condition is true. The second condition is light 2 dot switch, which is attached to this switch. So basically what we're saying here is when both these conditions are true, not one or the other, but both, then this multi-data trigger gets activated, and anything in setters gets activated. So let's go into setters, and you can see the setter I added here is set to property text, and the value 2 lights are on is typed into the text string. Now anything could be typed into this text string, it's up to the user. So basically, when those two conditions are true, this text is populated into this label. Now, I have a second multi-data trigger in here, and it's not necessary, but I added it to just show you a different way of handling this. In reality, I can delete either of these and just keep one of the two, and the label will still work. But let's look at the second label. In this one, I'm utilizing element binding. So I added 2 conditions, and on the first condition, I'm using an element binding of light underscore 1. And remember, light underscore 1 is the name that I gave this button. And I'm picking image from the list. And the value is power underscore brushed underscore on dot png. And remember, that's the image that has the blue glow around the button. And the second condition, the binding is set to light 2, which is the name I gave this image button. We're setting the foreground, and the value, once again, this is the value code for that orange color that appears when this light switch is turned on. So what it's saying is that when the image with the glow on it is set for this button, and the image and the foreground color is set to orange for this button, both those conditions are true, which means that anything that is in setter will be applied. So again, if you go into setter, it's a text and 2 lights are on. That's it for my tutorial on triggers. I hope it was useful. If you guys have any questions, please reach out to us out on the Home Remote Google group. I'm sure myself, Bill, or any other user would be happy to help you out with stuff that they know. Thanks for your time, guys.